Hi class. This week in logic we're working on the categorical syllogism, and so I want to take a few minutes to talk to you all about that. And since today, the day that I'm filming, is a beautiful day, beautiful weather, nice breeze, you can see the plants moving behind me, I thought I'd do it outside. So this is kind of like having class outside if we were on campus. So by now, I hope that you're familiar with the basic form of the categorical proposition, right? Sort of the sentences that will form the premise and the conclusion of a categorical syllogism. So the categorical proposition is going to basically be made out of Q, which will stand for a quantifier, then the subject, then I'll just put C for copula, and then the predicate. So, categorical proposition, we have the quantifier, the subject, C standing here for copula, and then the predicate. So, quantifier is a word like all, some, or no. Subject can be any noun basically, or any class. Technically, Aristotelian Aristotelian logic is a logic of classes, which is why we have to quantify them. And proper names like Socrates or Aristotle are treated as classes with only one member. Then the copula is going to be basically affirmative or negative. Affirmative would be is or are, and then negative would be is not or are not, and then the predicate is some description of the class. So we could have something like all fish are mammals. That would be a categorical proposition, but false, right? Propositions don't have to be true. They can be true or false. The syllogism is built out of a combination of categorical propositions, and they'll typically be three. So you might have all A is B, all B is C, all A is C, and I'll just put a line here to separate the premises from the conclusions. Right, so when we have this, we now have a valid categorical syllogism. Now, if you think about the possible combinations of quantifiers, right? Remember, I said there's three of all, some, or no. And then the possible combinations of copulas, affirmative or negative. Aristotle figured out that there are about 259 different possible syllogistic forms. You'll be glad to know that most of them are invalid and not worth studying. When it comes to determining the validity of a syllogism, you really have a couple different options that you can choose and apply. Option one is to track down an official list of the 15 or 16 valid syllogistic forms and just memorize that list. Option two is to understand why those forms are valid in the first place, and so that you can then discern for any syllogism you meet whether or not it is valid based on your understanding of those rules. And those rules would be things like, I'll just run through a few of them because I don't want to make this video so long that you stop watching. Actually, here. So, here is a cat, right? We could say all cats are mammals. This is a boy. We could also say all boys are mammals. So we have these two. Could we then conclude that all cats are boys? Or all boys are cats? No, and there are reasons why we can't draw that conclusion. Is that you have to have what's called a distributed middle. The middle term, which you should be familiar with, should appear in the correct the correct place in the syllogism. So in this one, B is the middle term, and it's predicate in one, subject in the other. If it's not, it doesn't automatically mean that the syllogism is invalid, but it makes it extremely difficult, extremely unlikely that the syllogism will be invalid. Other rules have to do with quantification. If you have a particularly quantified premise, so some this or some that, or a no premise, like no fish, then it is impossible for your conclusion to have a higher quantity than the premise. So if you have a particularly quantified premise, your conclusion has to be particularly quantified. If you have some this, blah, 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 some that, blah, 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 therefore all, blah, 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 you automatically know that that's invalid because the quantity of the conclusion cannot validly be more than the quantity of the smallest premise, of the lowest quantification in the premise. So even if you had all this, blah, 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 some this, blah, 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 the only valid conclusion could be something involving some, blah, blah, blah. So that's one rule. Another rule has to do with negations. If you have a negative copula in the premise, doesn't matter which one, the conclusion also has to be negative. So if I say some cats are not smart, and then say some cats are whatever, because I have that are not smart, or are not, my conclusion has to be are not. I can't have a affirmative conclusion if I have a single negative premise. Right? So there are other rules. I can't get into them all right now in this short video, but they're in your readings and in your PowerPoints and things like that. But you want to somehow, as you're sort of dealing with Aristotelian logic and maybe struggling with it, try to pick a method for analyzing syllogisms that you're going to use, either rule-based or memorization-based. Both have their advantages and disadvantages, but either one will serve you in, I guess you could say, at least in taking the test, if not in life. One other final point is that when I'm asking you on homework or in a test if a syllogism is valid, at this point, because we're still using ordinary language, sort of ordinary human words, we're not yet in symbolic logic, trust your instincts. If something seems invalid, then take a second look at it to make sure that it might really actually be invalid. Because one way of thinking about validity and invalidity is to think about whether or not something makes sense. A valid argument is one that basically makes sense, and an invalid one doesn't make sense. So if you're looking at an argument and you're like, something about that seems off, something about that doesn't seem to make sense, use that as a motivation to look a little deeper at that argument and analyze it and see if it really does in fact not make sense.